Are you looking for a way to make co-parenting easier? Talking Parents can help you streamline your shared parenting responsibilities and minimize conflict by keeping all interactions organized and documented. With Talking Parents, you can stop worrying about the he said, she said, and focus on what matters most, your children. Download the app in the Apple or Google Play Store and start a 30-day free trial today. Today we're talking about navigating divorce with emotional resilience, and we're going to be looking at the forces that hold us back, both internally and externally. And with me today is Megan Dalla-Camina. And Megan is an award-winning women's leadership and empowerment expert. I am so excited about today's conversation. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited for our conversation as well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So the first thing, I'm going to ask two things of you. The first thing is I love my guests starting by telling the audience something that is unique about them that doesn't necessarily have to do with their 9-to-5 job. And I know we were just chatting offline, but what would you like to share with the audience?
Something unique about me that doesn't have to, I would say I love going on pilgrimage to India, and I've just come back. So I go every year.
Oh.
Yes. And it's a deep part of my practice and my spiritual practice and journey. And yeah, I've literally just returned. So doesn't
So
have it underpins everything that I do, but it doesn't have anything to do with my job, if you know what I mean.
it's perfect. I love it. That's very exciting. And can you just tell our audience before we dive in a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and certainly your new book that we'll be talking about later on?
Yes, thank you. So in a nutshell, I spent 18 years in corporate America working for companies like GE, PwC, IBM. I'm here in Australia, in Asia, and around the world. So that a very long time. And I've been in my own company for 11 years around women's development, women's empowerment, women's leadership, and personal and professional development. And I'm also an academic and an author. And my book that's just come out is called Women Rising: The Forces That Hold Us Back, the Tools to Help Us Rise. So that's
And
me in a
in her,
nutshell.
and in her spare time, she's getting a PhD.
In my not spare time,
Yeah.
yes, I'm doing and loving my PhD research and study.
Utterly impressed, Megan. So thank you so much for joining me. I think that the fact that you have a book that talks about the forces that hold women back, and here we are talking about divorce, and of course, often in my world with my audience, high conflict divorce. We so often talk about both of those internal forces, the monkey mind, the confused heart, the family of origin history that holds us back, that we don't, and the unconscious beliefs, as well as everything that the world brings in, the marriage, the divorce process. And so we were talking offline that you have this like beautifully methodical way of going through it. When you talk about external forces that hold women back, let's start there and see if we can pull in the world of divorce a little bit into that perspective that you present in your book.
Yes. Oh gosh, yeah, there's so much there. And it does map beautifully, I think, to divorce, having I'm a divorced person as well. So the forces that hold us back, the way that I write about it and the research in my book is looking at what is outside of us, all of us, all genders, but I write through a women's lens, but it's inclusive of all genders and particularly men as well, that hold us back and that can really keep us stuck and questioning ourselves. And by that, I'm talking about patriarchy. I'm talking about societal expectations. I'm talking about gendered expectations. And there's 6 particular paradoxes, then I'll just rattle them off: the leadership paradox, the empowerment paradox, the motherhood paradox, the confidence paradox, the visibility paradox, and the success paradox. And all of those actually have a lens that you could unpack from a divorce perspective. And some really obviously, like the motherhood paradox, which is this paradox that says that society expects women to parent like they don't have jobs outside the home and work like they don't have children. And it's this impossible paradox
How
that women,
beautifully said. Yeah.
thank you when I say it right, thank you, this just unmeetable expectation that women butt up against every single day, and so often don't realize that's one of the core reasons why we constantly feel guilty, that we're not good enough, that we can't make it work, that we can't succeed on either front. So that's one example. And after divorce, I remember back when I was getting divorced with a 18-month-old
Oh,
child
boy.
and a big executive job, and just feeling like I was failing at everything and didn't understand either the external forces or the internal forces. So I wish I'd had your work and podcast back then for sure.
And I think that when we don't understand, like I'm 18 years post-divorce, but I didn't understand about mental health issues and neurodiversion and stuff. And so I didn't understand what I was dealing with. And in today's day and age, it's the same thing, just all of those external things and then everything inside. And so we blame ourselves, right? It's kind of like I'm the failure, I'm the mess, I'm the incapable one. And my sense is with your external, you're connecting dots. And when we can connect the dots and understand all of the many things that pull it at us, what does that do for us? How does that help us pivot?
So beautifully articulated. What I find from the work that I do with literally thousands and thousands of women every year from all different cultures and countries and ages and stages is that there's an underlying thread that ties women's lives and thought patterns together, which is it's my fault, right? And not only is it my fault, but it's just me. I'm the only one dealing with this. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to internalize it and blame and shame myself. And that's the narrative in which I'm going to live my life. And what I know to be true from my own experience, but also from all of the women that I work with and all of the research is when we can look at something and go, oh, now I understand better what's going on outside of me, number one. And number two, it's not just me. It's actually all of us. Then that our shoulders start to soften, that blame and shame starts to quieten down, and we can have more self-compassion for what we're going through, and then we can start using the tools, to really help us navigate that situation, rather than certainly what I did when I got divorced and what so many of us do in our everyday lives is we sit in it. We don't know how to get out of that cognitive dissonance that's going on in our minds. Yeah, and that has incredibly negative impacts on all aspects of our well-being, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual as well.
Right. Because when we're sitting in it, we're not addressing it, processing it, and releasing it. We're numbing it,
Yes,
we're
extracting
ignoring
ourselves
it,
from
we're
it.
pushing it
Yes.
down, we're running
Yeah.
away from it, but no matter where we go, there we are.
Yeah.
And the word that came to mind as you were talking is that there's something about realizing how much we're part of a collective, that we are not a self, a single self, just suffering our own, even though we are in the house with that spouse and these kids and this situation and these finances, we feel so separated. And yet I'm hearing that there's something, and I love how many people you've worked with. It just brings such a juicy flavor to it that no matter your culture, your location, your age, your stage, you're part of a collective.
Yes. Yeah, and I think for women particularly, I see so much comfort in that for women. And we are so connected, and we need that connection, and we need to, like when I hear your story, I feel better about my story.
Right.
But we can feel, even in a world that's so connected, we often just feel so isolated. We feel like that we're isolated in terms of the stories that we're telling ourselves in our minds. We can be isolated in our busyness because there's no time and no space to have that connection to say, how are you? Like, how are you really? What's going on for you? And that's why podcasts like yours are so important, right? Because it brings us into that collective experience. Yeah.
There's one other question on the men's front that I want to ask, because when we talk about society and the patriarchy, one of the things I've found over the years is how women connect easily, even women who don't have a lot of friends or community. We're just wired that way. Whereas my men are so painfully isolated. And I'm wondering if it's different in corporate. So, of course, I'm dealing also with men who are successful out in the world and perhaps abused behind closed doors, just like the women. But the difference with the men is they don't have the friendships, they don't have the community, they don't necessarily have the experience or the permission to process, feel, be weak, struggle. Like there's so much that to me seems particularly heartbreaking because of the society and the messages and rules that men are raised with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I also work with men and write about men in the book and what about the men and where are the men in this equation? And there is this social construct that patriarchy is bad if you're a woman. Tick. But what we don't talk about is that patriarchy is also bad if you're a man, right? For a small percentage of men, patriarchy and the power and the privilege, awesome. Like, let's keep going. I think we know who those men. But for the vast majority of men, they also can really struggle and be held back by the patriarchal forces and the gendered expectations that we have of men. And as you say, one of those is don't show weakness. And we have don't get emotional, don't cry, don't share your feelings. There are so many, just like women have so many shoulds, men have so many don'ts. And that lack of permission and connection, I do think it's getting better. I live near the beach and I was down at the beach the other morning having my walk, and there was a men's circle that just popped up with a sign that said, all men welcome. And they were just standing in a circle on the beach, speaking to each other, sharing.
Oh my
I
goodness.
nearly cried. Like I found that so joyful and hopeful. And I am seeing more things like that. So I hope for men it's getting better. I have a 24-year-old son, and I see the way he connects with not just the women in his life, but the men in his life and how open and how much they share and tapped into their feminine as well as their masculine that they are. But I think this conversation and women having this conversation amongst women and with men will help create positive change and those open spaces and permission for men to really be human, like just be human and have that human experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And not hold so much on their shoulder. It's such a different holding on one's shoulders, but they too
Yeah.
hold so much on their shoulders. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit. One of the big things I'm always talking to my clients about is what happens between their ears. I actually have a program called Reclaim Your Mind, Evict Your Spouse from Your Mental Space, because so often they're answering, well, my husband, what do you think? Well, my husband says, but he's not even here. I'm not asking him. Well, my wife thinks, but she's not here. And so we were talking a little bit about the inner critic, and I know I want you to tell the audience all that you have around that. With this particular audience of people, there's the outer critic, the spouse, the blaming, shaming, diminishing, demeaning, belittling spouse. And then there's their own critic. And as I was doing the program, I realized that once I helped them evict their spouse from their mental space, I then had to really help them understand that what's going to swoop in isn't your celebrate her. It's your inner critic. Like we have to then like clean that out before we actually get to the real positives. Can you just talk us through your research, your perspective on those inner forces? Are you looking for a way to make co-parenting easier? Talking Parents can help you streamline your shared parenting responsibilities and minimize conflict by keeping all interactions organized and documented. With Talking Parents, you can stop worrying about the he said, she said, and focus on what matters most, your children. Download the app in the Apple or Google Play Store and start a 30-day free trial today. Divorce feels like an overwhelming perfect storm as you navigate pain, fear, and confusion while struggling with unfamiliar legal procedures and the pressure to make complex decisions that will impact the rest of your life. Our free Rapid Relief Call provides the clarity and confidence you're yearning for. Visit rapidreliefcall.com for support and guidance today.
So once we understand the external forces, as we've spoken about, we have to go inwards, right? We have to understand, number one, that there's an external patriarchy, but there's also the inner patriarch. And the inner patriarch, certainly for women, but also for men, as we've just spoken about, so often that's our inner critic voice. That's the voice that's saying, you should do this, you must do this, you have to do this or be this, don't do this. Don't be this if you're a man. And one of the first things that I write about is really, really get that. Like you're not just creating all of these things in your head. Like it's actually stemming from somewhere. And I think that's a comforting realization as well. Like, again, it's not just me. I'm not mad. There's a reason why I have all of these inner critic stories. So that's a really critical piece. Another critical piece that you mentioned, I love the way that you describe it, is one of the key questions around the inner critic is, who is your inner critic voice? And in the work that you're doing, absolutely could be the spouse who's no longer there. They may not have been there for 5 years.
That's great.
They're still the person who's running the traffic.
Exactly.
And giving you all the signals. It could be your mother, could be your father, could be your 5th grade teacher who said that one thing to you about your writing ability that still directs how you show up in the career choices that you make. So who is the voice, or who are the cacophony of the voices that are in your mind? And then what I write about specifically as well in the book are the archetypes, because I wanted to get really deep into what is the flavor of your inner critic? What is the flavor of your inner voice? If it had a sort of a personality archetype, what would it be? And I identified 13 through my research and work, and just a few of them, the perfectionist, who, and so many people will relate to that.
She's part of my chorus.
She's part of your chorus, who, and the voice of the perfectionist is one more time. Just do it one more time. Like, it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. If it's not perfect, you're going to fail, and failure will be fatal. So do it again and keep going. And that's that driving, striving perfectionist. Another one is the people pleaser. And that people pleaser, so many women listening will relate to the reformed people pleaser. So it is possible. The people pleaser is like, I need them to like me. Right. And I need everything that I do is driven. My inner critic is always driving me to make people happy, to keep the peace, and to put everyone's needs above my own. Another one, which is my primary archetype, is the overachiever. Which is this, again, this driving and striving and what's next. And we need to understand, where does that come from?
What's different between the perfectionist and the overachiever?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are, like, they do come together, and some of them cluster, of course, right? Just like if we're looking at our character strengths, you see clusters. I'm not a perfectionist, interestingly enough. The perfectionist is driven by that sense of, I'm going to fail. And if I don't make this perfect, I'm going to fail.
And failure is going to be catastrophic for some reason.
Failure is catastrophic, exactly. And I won't recover. And it's that very much, Professor Carol Dweck talks about the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. Like, it's very much that fixed mindset. The overachiever is, and like I'll give you my personal example, like I'm very driven by purpose. Like everything that I do is driven by this purpose to help women rise. So from an overachiever perspective, it's always like I can be doing more to help. I can be doing more to be of service. And this idea, and what about this? And what about this? And it's about how do we just bring that down to say, just do this one thing.
Oh my God, I call myself splatter paint. I'm like, let's
Ah,
go in 15 different directions at once. There's so much to be done. So that is
there's
the
so
over.
much to be done. That's the overachiever.
Yeah.
And there's more. There's the ideal mother, which really factors in. Like if you're going through a divorce and you are the ideal mother archetype, which, as we spoke about before with that motherhood paradox, we can really struggle to find our role and find our place. And then one of the others I'll mention, because I'm just seeing this picture from a divorce perspective, the comparer. And the comparer is I'm always looking to see what everybody else is doing and then judging myself in comparison. And so often these days, that's I'm judging people on social media, right? I'm comparing myself
Oh,
to how they're
completely.
going. Yeah. And we see, like, I just thought of from a divorce perspective, like I think back to when Gwyneth Paltrow got divorced, and it was this, oh, we're consciously uncoupling, and it's all so beautiful and, you know, ethereal and so stunning. And then we're sitting over here going through the most hideous divorce that you could ever imagine. And we're looking at that, comparing ourselves. That's the comparer, and that's the inner critic. Why can't you do it like that? Why aren't you like that? That's so perfect. And I'm so terrible, as an example.
I always throw out 12-step slogans because I love them so much. So the 12-step slogan, of course, is when you compare, you despair.
Yes.
And
I
it
love
just doesn't it always just lead to that? It's like I'm going to
it.
compare,
Always
and
does.
how often do I end up being on top? No, I'm like I'm less than. I'm not good enough. I'm not
Yes.
as good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So
that's the inner critic, right? That's why this work is so important. That
yeah.
you're doing, that I'm doing, that we're helping people do, because when we can really start to understand, number one, there's a voice inside my head and it's not mine and it's not true. And number two, understand what impact is that having on my life and my choices and how I feel about myself. And number three, I'm not at the whim. Like there are things that I can do about this and tools that I can use to move through it. We really reclaim our power, which is what we want for everybody.
Right. And certainly the process of divorce is much like shedding the snake skin that doesn't fit you anymore and growing into your new skin and your new life. And I wasn't planning on going here, but I think it'd be really interesting. We have a lot of listeners who are high achieving men and women. And so there's a little bit of a dichotomy. So here they are, at least presenting very successful in their professional life. And if they're coming to me, they're the one on the getting the short end of the stick at home, right? They're the one who's married to someone who might just be stubborn and inflexible or difficult or have some neurodivergence so that they feel abandoned and they don't feel empathy, or someone who just is nasty and kind of puts you down. And so there's this almost schizophrenic feeling. It's like, and this was my story. I would go out and I was working at a printing plant. So it was like me and 100 men, and nobody effed with me. Like I was a top salesperson. I did great. I put everyone in their place. And then I came home, ears up to my shoulders up to my earlobes, wondering what was going to come. And I'd walk through the front door and I was like a mouse. So I went from like a lion to a mouse. Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of the work that you do and where we can go with that?
Oh, I just had such a clear picture as you were saying. And I think it's so many people's experience. And that I talk a lot about authenticity in my work, which is such a buzzword, right? But really, we're always, as human beings, trying to get into alignment. We're always trying to get into balance. We're always trying to find that homeostasis, whether we know it or not.
Right.
And They'll say, oh, there's no such thing as balance. Yeah, that is our design. That is our human design, to be in balance. And to also be, from a spiritual perspective, in alignment with ourselves. And this challenge of, I'm this person when I go to work, and then I come home and I'm a shadow of that self. And
Yes.
that's where I feel like who I am. I was the same. That's where I'm in my power. That's where I feel like I'm authentic and I'm being who I am. And then I come home and I'm like, I'm hiding or I'm shielding or whatever it is that you're doing because you can't be your full self there. I mean, that again, on all levels of our well-being, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, that is completely derailing. And often we don't let ourselves know that. We don't, because then that means I have to actually do something about this.
Yeah.
And I saw a stat once that said women, and I can't give you the source, but that women take about 3 to 5 years to decide to get divorced, and once they decide, they're done. But it can take, and again, that was my experience, can take so long to deal with this cognitive dissonance that we're going through. And I think some of that inner critic narrative that happens for us in that situation is, oh, it's not that bad.
Oh my
It's not
God.
bad. Does
And
that resonate with you?
yeah,
Yeah.
because number one, whatever your bad is, you've had an opportunity to normalize over how many years. And then I remember my family would be worried about my safety. And I'd be like, he's just angry. He gets angry. Like it would just, and the other thing that I learned years later was that based on our family of origin, we could have a very high tolerance to bad behavior and very low expectations for good behavior. And so you put all of that together in a mix and it can be quite the cocktail.
Yes. Yes. And there's also that compare as well. It's not as bad as this.
Right.
Again, it's that normalizing and it's that trying to keep ourselves, I'm safe and this is okay, versus seeing it for what it actually is and then having to do those really hard steps of having to remove ourselves. So all of that feeds our inner critic into a frenzy. When the inner critic of when we're at work, that little, well, why can't I be like this at home? You know,
Right.
like I'm so strong and powerful. And that paradox that we face, that and then we go home and we're like this, and that just erodes our self-esteem, our self-confidence, our sense of self-efficacy, and that feeds our inner critic. So it's like this just vicious cycle and whirlwind that until we realize it and see it, we're just inside that volcano.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask you one more question before we pivot to tools and give our listeners something to work with. So you said 3 to 5 years, which was probably my schedule. I've worked with clients who, will say, I I started 18 years ago, like where it's really been decades. I'm wondering, and so there's a story that you tell yourself, I'm better off staying. I'll stay for the kids. I'll stay until the kids are in college. It's not that bad. I can just, I'm wondering how similar that tug of war, that struggle with indecision is if you're in a corporate situation that doesn't serve you. So I'm dealing with people who are in an intimate love relationship that doesn't serve them, a marriage that doesn't serve them. Can you share what's the same or different about the professional experience?
Yes, that's such a great question. There's so many similarities. So many similarities. I think about my own exit journey from corporate after 18 years. It took me 3 years. It
Ah,
took me 3 years to
in the
really,
5 year.
yeah, that 3 to 5 year window. And I see this with We've had 10,000 women through the Women Rising program in the last 3 years, which is that's a lot of women in terms of a sample size for research and looking at women's experiences. And the reason the first part of the book that I write about the forces that hold us back is so important is because women gaslight themselves to look at their work situation, look at their manager, look at a toxic boss, look at a toxic culture, look at bullying, or these really bad situations that happen in workplaces everywhere, every day. And they have the same internal narrative going on. Oh, it's not so bad. It's my fault. I'm to blame if I just change. Oh, well, it's better here than it's going to be. Like very similar narratives that
Wow.
you find in a spousal situation. So yeah, I've never actually thought about that until you asked that question, but I think it can be a very similar process. And that's why we need to understand, what are these forces? What are these paradoxes for women at work specifically, which is what I write about, and how it impacts us and what do we do about it? Because once we see it, and this is what I keep hearing from readers, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see the leadership paradox, where we say, we want you to lead as a woman, we want you in leadership positions, we want gender balance. But then we also say, but don't go lead like that. Like you need to lead like this, in this box, lead like a man. And then you'll be successful. Like that's the leadership paradox. Or the success paradox that says to women, be successful, but in a sea of expectations. So again, don't step outside the gender lines and the social expectations for what we have of you as a woman. And you can only be successful in that box. Once we see these things, we can't unsee them. And it changes everything for how we show up. So yeah, so many similarities.
Yeah. I was just speaking with a new woman this morning, and one of the questions, because we really can delude ourselves, and it's not that bad. Maybe I should stay. Maybe I haven't given him or her a fair shot. And so I'll usually just say, okay, I'm gonna take notes. You tell me all of the ways that you have felt incredibly loved by your spouse over the last 3 to 5 years. And I think it falls into the once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is such a jaw-dropping exercise for 95% of the people I do it with. And I just get real quiet. And when he takes out the garbage and he'll watch our kid when they're sick, and it's like, anything else you want to add to that? And it's just, because we've been deluding ourselves. And then all of a sudden it's real quiet and it's your list, and that list is just sad.
Yes.
And that's the beginning of, oh, shoot.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I see if we look at that from a work context.
Yeah.
When we have our group coaching calls and the women come in thinking it's just them and and they're gaslighting themselves and all of everything we're talking about. And then they come in and they start listening to other women and you see them supporting each other and realizing you should not put up with that, but they're putting up with that. And then they realize, oh, right. Oh, I've got some work to do here. So yeah, it's very similar in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Me too. Thank
Um,
you.
so let's pivot to, what do we do about this?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm so curious to hear some of maybe you can leave the listeners with one or two tools or strategies. That would be lovely.
Yes, absolutely. It's so funny you ask because this book was meant to be a manifesto. Like when I had the vision, it was going to be just the first section, like just the forces that hold us back. And this small book, I had this dream of writing a small book because I've always written big books. And as I got into it, I'm like, I can't just tell you the problem, right? I have to give you, I'm a teacher and a coach. I have to give you the tools. Okay, so let's talk about two. The first one is across the board for the inner critic. And here is, and this will be no surprise to you, I'm sure, with the work that you do, but this is the really simple process that I use. Doesn't matter what your archetype is, that will really help you start to work with your inner critic. So 3 steps. First step, start to catch the stories. You have to start to tune in to the stories that we're telling ourselves. And that could be the story that you're telling yourself about the fight that you had with your spouse last night. It could be the story you're telling yourself about the meeting with the divorce lawyer you had last week. It could be a situation at work and why you didn't put yourself forward for that new job that you really want. What are the stories that you're telling yourself? Because for so many of us, before we start doing this work, we really have no idea what's going on in our minds.
Oh, it's
We
totally
have
the
these
tail wagging the dog, right?
Yes, exactly. So this first step is all about get conscious,
Beautiful.
tune in, raise your level of awareness, get intimately acquainted with what's going on inside your head. And I love to tell people and suggest that they carry a little notebook around for a couple of weeks. You could also do it with the notes up on your phone. And every time you hear a story coming up, a narrative, just write it down. You don't have to do anything with it. Just write it down. Write it down, write it down, write it down. And then eventually what you're going to do is you're going to pick one of those stories. And you're going to go to step 2, which is interrupt the cognitive dissonance by asking the very simple question, is that true? Is that true? Is the fact that I'm not smart enough to go for that job, is that true? And what's the evidence? Is that true that if I get divorced, I'm going to be alone and unhappy for the rest of my natural life? Is that true? Right. So we do that second step and we're really trying to understand what's actually going on here. Some of these stories might be true. Okay. But then there's alternate stories and there's alternate truths and there's lies and lies and lies and lies that we're telling ourselves about ourselves and our situation. So that's step 2. And then step 3 is what's the reframe? What's the reframe that's going to help you? Number 1, feel better about yourself and your situation. And number 2, take the action that you want to take. What's the step? What's the thing that you want to do that the stories that you're telling yourself are stopping you from doing? Whether that's something really simple, like speaking up in a meeting at work, or something really challenging, like asking for the divorce. And I find, again, like I've used that model myself for 15 years. I've taught it to many more than 10,000 people. And if we can work those 3 steps, like it's our full-time job with our inner critic, it can feel really hard and clunky at the beginning, but like I can now work through that in 30 seconds or less.
And I would love for you to talk about the benefit of that. So if my mind is running the gamut and I'm thinking things and I'm pouring into these negative things I'm thinking about myself, that has an impact on my life and my future. And if I'm short circuiting it in 30 seconds and being someone who celebrates myself and who holds myself up, that's a different energy and that has an impact. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and I'll give you a really simple example that happened to me recently because it might be helpful. So I'm in semester 1 of my PhD program and I'm doing it in the US. The really small classes, like 12 people in a class. My classes are at 3 to 6 a.m., by the way, my time, so that's fun. But 30% of the grade in this PhD program is active participation in the class. So I show up for my first class, 3 a.m. That's fine. And you have to have done all of the reading and then you show up and you have to discuss, like a scholar, all of the readings and the analysis and everything else. So I'm sitting in this class, and if you don't speak, you fail, basically, the class. I'm sitting in this class listening to all of these incredible people talk and share their insights and their findings. And I'm sitting here with my inner critic story of, oh my God, why am I here? I'm not smart enough to be here. I'm going to say something, like all of these stories coming up. If I speak, they're going to realize that I'm going to kick me out, and my inner critic's having a field day. But because I've done this work, so this went on for about 15 minutes. And of course, very quickly, because I've been doing this work for so long, I realized, oh, okay, the inner critic's
I've been
flaring up.
hijacked.
I'm being hijacked, and that's the skeptic archetype. I'm not smart enough. So I literally worked through that in 30 seconds. I'm like, what's the story I'm telling myself? I'm not smart enough. Is that true? No. I've got 2 master's degrees. I got accepted into this really hard to get into program. I have something to say about this analysis I've done on these readings. Reframe into action, speak. And literally, as soon as I got to that, I just put my Zoom hand up, off I went. And it was a bit clunky, but I warmed up, and I've been fine ever since. Now, if I hadn't have done that, I would have sat in that class for 3 hours, sitting inside my inner critic story, I'm not smart enough. And who knows where that would have led to in terms of my PhD journey in that very first pivotal class.
Right.
So like, I think it's a simple example. Hopefully that's a simple illustration. But what we need to realize is the stories that we tell ourselves, our inner critic story, runs our life. Not just how we feel about ourselves, it runs our life.
Completely. I had a client in a group years ago when I was doing in-person groups, and she got divorced. She was in a basement apartment after having a beautiful home. And she would come week after week and say how she was going to live out her life in some crappy, dull basement apartment. And I think the third or fourth time she said it, I said, and so it shall be.
Yes.
and she was like, what? She is married. She's living in a gorgeous, remarried, living in a gorgeous home. But we talked, the whole group was talking about where our mind goes, our energy flows, and it drives us in that direction. And to your point, it's not that people don't want to change it, they just don't know. I so often talk about the bad habit of ruminating. And it's, well, my mind, this morning I was on the phone with someone, my mind just does that. It's like, well, let's talk about your control. But we don't have control until we learn that we have control. And to your point, turn on the light by bringing your conscious awareness to it. And then you can question it, and then you can reframe it. But I do think that I was so painfully unconscious for so long until I slammed into my divorce. But I think that we do have so many people, like really good people, really quality people, who are walking, almost sleepwalking through life because they don't realize that they have so much agency in their mind that they've just never taken up.
Yes. And I think that's the majority of people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
We are just, and I was like that as well until I woke up, and then I went back to sleep, and then I woke up again, and I went back to sleep, and right? And it's just this constant evolution of being awake, like being awake.
Yeah.
And I love what you were saying about the questions. Professor David Cooperrider says our life unfolds in the direction of the questions that we ask.
Oh,
I love that so much, because if you really think about that, and like think about your client, think about the inner critic, because the inner critic isn't just telling us stories, it's also asking questions, right? And we can program our minds to ask questions that are going to lead us in a certain direction. The second tool that I will offer is in the tools section, in the very first section, which is around like life vision and creating the vision for your life. And just everyone asking themselves the question, what is the life that I really want to create for myself? And it sounds so simple, but 95% of us never ask ourselves that question.
and I don't remember in school ever being like, okay, kids, okay, high school students, okay, college students. Like, it's such a fascinating.
What's your job? What's your job? What's the job you're going to get is what we're asked. Not what I've always spoken to my son about, which is, what do you want your life to look like? It's the most basic, fundamental question. It's my favorite question. If I could only ask people one question, that's what it would be. What do you want your life to look like? And step into the possibility of that question. Like thinking about your client in the basement. What if you, okay, and so it is, if that's what you're going to tell yourself, but what else could be possible? What else could be possible? And how do we open up those possibilities with those questions that will lead you in a different direction? And you have control over that, nobody else.
And it's what's so great about this practice is when you ask the question, sometimes mind may just be defending the nightmare. And then that's worth, well, why am I defending that thing that I actually don't want so much? Like, let's go a little deeper. Let's peel back a little bit more. I love that.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And it can also be, and I love people thinking about this absolutely in your life, your relationship, but also your business or your career. Is this it? What do I want my career to look like? What do I want my life to look like? What do I want my family situation to look like? And is this it? And you will get an instant hit on that. You tune into your gut, you will get an instant hit.
Absolutely.
On whether this is it or not. And then, great, what do I want it to look like? Yeah. And tune into the stories that come up around that, as you say.
I love this. I love this. The book sounds fabulous. I'm going to pick a copy up. Tell our audience again where they can find you, the name of the book, where they can get it. And if you have a gift, do you have a gift for us? I think you have a gift for us.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
I have here free inner critic quiz.
Yes, we have that. So the book womenrisingbook.com is the simplest, and in the US, amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, or your friendly local bookstore. And we've done this fun quiz to support the book. So you can get it at theinnercriticquiz.com. And it is a free quiz where you can go and work out which of the 13 archetypes is you. And it will actually grade them for you and tell you, and then help you with the strategies for what do you do with that. And then the book takes you deeper.
Oh, I love that. I'm definitely
that
taking
that is a great fun tool that everyone can use. Theinnercriticquiz.com. I was just checking I gave you the right URL, and I did. So that's helpful. And I'm at Megan Dalla-Camina. So on all social media handles at Megan Dalla-Camina. I would love to connect with people.
And you can get the spelling of Megan's name in the show notes, and there'll be a hyperlink there too. So you can scoot right over to her website and check her out. Megan, this has just been delightful.
Thank you. That's the word I was going to use as well. It has been absolutely delightful.
Yeah, and thank you so much for what you do in the world. You are touching and supporting so many women. That's just so impressive. And I'm tickled that you had the time and interest in coming to speak with me and my listeners.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your work. I wish I had you when I was going through my divorce. I think I would have experienced it so completely differently. This work that you are doing is so important. So thank you for everything you're doing in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll be back again real soon with another episode. Until then, you take care. Thanks for joining us on the Journey Beyond Divorce podcast. I hope you found guidance and encouragement to help you along your journey. If you like my podcast, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. You can also visit us at jbddivorcesupport.com, where our team of coaches support both men and women through our one-on-one coaching, group programs, online courses, and free resources. Stay tuned for our next episode, and I'll talk to you soon.